There has been a nuclear accident in the Soviet Union, and the Soviets have admitted that it happened. The Soviet version is this. One of the atomic reactors at the Chernobyl atomic power plant near the city of Kiev was damaged, and there is speculation in Moscow that people were injured and may have died.
Kyiv, Ukraine housed the Chernobyl nuclear power plant where the world's worst nuclear accident happened. Before the disaster, it was a thriving town filled with people constantly walking the streets and going to all the shops around town. Many visited the beaches and rode the famous Ferris wheel we had there. It was a great place to live. There were so many things to do. It was very family friendly, had great neighborhoods, and great schools for the kids. I just loved it. It was April 25th, 1986. It was such a beautiful evening. I remember thinking, goodness, it's hot outside. You would have never thought that anything would have happened that day. I started to realize something might be wrong when my husband Valerie didn't come back from his night shift at the plant. He worked as a foreman at the stricken reactor. I remember leaving my apartment in Pripyat to go out and look for him. I was scared something might have happened to him. As I walked out, I noticed some people were in masks, and the kids were running around barefoot in the puddles, which only made me more concerned. I had absolutely no idea what was going on or what had happened to my husband. I went to go look for answers and asked those around me, but they were just as confused as I was, or didn't explain things to us straight away. It seemed as though everything was kept a secret, and we were all left in the dark. I decided to go to the local clinic to see if he had been admitted. I found him in one of the beds. His face was bright red, and his skin had been burnt badly. The nurses told me that he was exposed to high levels of radiation.
Yeah, I remember that day, April 25th, 1986. That's a day you can never forget. It just seemed like any other day. It was a beautiful evening, particularly warm and clear. I clocked in at the usual time for my night shift at the plant where I worked as an engineer mechanic. That night, the newly commissioned number 4 reactor was being safety tested.
I remember some people I worked with started arguing about the right power levels at which to start the test. So as power levels were lowered in preparation, they dropped too low and the reactor just stopped. Little did we know that a dangerous hotspot was building deep within the reactor. We had to raise the power, which means we had to remove the boron control rods. It was like cocking a gun. The reactor was turned into a volcanic stream pressure cooker. Emergency shutdown procedures were started, but when the control rods were replaced, the graphic tips caused the power levels to rise so dramatically it caused 2 explosions that blew off the safety cap from the reactor.
It was the worst nuclear accident in history. It wasn't until many months later that I came to hear that there was years of error and cover-up of fatal flaws in the reactor design, which is why it made it unstable at low power levels.
The radiation was just terrible. You couldn't see or smell it, but the effects were very catastrophic. Those who worked in the plant, like my husband, were exposed to so much radiation that there wasn't much they could do for him, and he had to be flown to Moscow. 45 days later, he died. He was one of the first people to die after the disaster. After that, my 2 daughters and I ended up moving to Kyiv, where we still live. Within hours after the explosion, dozens of people began to fall ill, reporting severe headaches and metallic tastes in their mouths, along with uncontrollable fits of coughing and vomiting. When that happened, there were hopes that an evacuation would not be necessary, but 2 hours later, the radiation levels rose so high that it would be remembered as their highest level ever. At 12 p.m., officials ordered on local radio for people to pack what they would need for 2 or 3 days. It took 3.5 hours and all 1,200 buses for the evacuation of Pripyat. It was scary. It truly was. 1 second, you think it isn't as bad as you would expect it to be. And then the next, we were being evacuated. We had no time to gather our belongings. Everything was just left there. We couldn't even bring our pets. There was still some hope that we'd only be gone for a few days and that everything would be fine. But no one ever came back. Radiation levels were too high for anyone to live there.
The secrecy of the Soviet bureaucracy didn't help the matter. It just made things worse. Victor Bryukina, the owner of the power plant, didn't think it was needed to alert everyone when radiation levels were at 3.6. The only problem with that was that it only went that high. This caused evacuations to be delayed, which exposed everyone in town to radiation for 2 days, until Sunday, April 27th, when they held a meeting between 10 to 12 to decide whether the evacuation was necessary.
Once they started taking things more seriously, they hatched up a plan to drop about 5,000 tons of sand to the reactor to stop the fire. Making matters worse, there could have been an even bigger explosion down at the furnace. They had to start counting lives. That day we lost a whole group of brave men who sacrificed their lives to save everyone else's.
And yet, they still had the decency to continue to withhold the truth of what actually happened and put all the blame on the crews for making too many errors during testing. Those members who survived were sentenced to prison. And 2 years later, to the day of the incident, Valery Legasov committed suicide.